In today's video, I'm going to give you 5 tips for trouble-free strip piecing. Hi, I'm Kim Jamison Hurst of Chatterbox Quilts, and in today's video, I'm going to give you some tips that make strip piecing easy, and I'm going to give you the solution to some common problems that you might have when you're making strip pieced blocks. So here's an example of 2 different strip piece blocks. So let's get started with some of the tips that will make it easy to make blocks just like these. Tip number 1 is what to use as a foundation for strip piece blocks. And my favorite thing to use is paper, specifically catalog paper. And that's what I have here with the 6.5-inch foundation I'm going to use to make a strip piece block. So I like to get catalogs just like this. They have that kind of shiny paper on them. And the one thing I will tell you to make sure of is that the ink does not transfer off the paper onto your fabric. And the way to check that is just by rubbing your hand across it and checking your fingers. If they come out black, don't use that paper. If they don't come out with any ink on them, then that paper is okay to use for your foundation. And the reason I like to use paper is because it comes off very easily, especially when you shorten your stitch length when you're making your strip piece block. Tip number 2 has to do with what happens at the corners. So if you are working on your block and you've gotten to this stage and it's time to add what should be probably the last piece on your corner, but your fabric strip is not long enough or wide enough to cover and you still got some foundation showing, you've got a problem. And it's not that hard to fix it. Let me tell you how to do that. Couple things. First off, get a bigger piece of fabric. Okay, that's pretty obvious probably. And hopefully you have a piece of fabric that once you take in that seam allowance is going to be big enough to cover that corner. All right, that piece would work, for example. Or what you could do is you could get another piece of fabric like this and sew them together, because trust me, you really won't notice that when the block is all made. Or if your piece is really close and there's just a little bit of foundation showing, you could take a narrower seam allowance. So instead of doing your 1/4-inch seam that you normally would do, you could do an 1/8 or a very, very small seam allowance, which might be just enough to get that piece to cover the corner. Okay, in this particular case, it wouldn't be. But if you were in on this side, for example, let's just pretend that this was the one that was showing a bit, where the foundation was showing, and you stitched it on and you came over to the side, you can see how it would cover that up perfectly. So either get a bigger piece of fabric or use a shorter seam allowance if there was only just a little tiny bit of that paper foundation showing. Tip number 3 has to deal with what happens if I don't have a long enough piece of fabric to go across my foundation. Now I'm going to give you a quick fix for this, but I do have an in-depth video that goes into more detail about it and some considerations, so check the description below to see the link to that video. But it's as simple as adding additional fabrics on. So you would just pick other fabrics. They don't have to be the same color or anything either. You could just pick different fabrics, stitch them on with a 1/4-inch seam allowance until you have a strip long enough to cover that foundation. Tip number 4 has to do with jelly roll strips. Now, when you're making a strip piece block like this one, it's much more interesting when the widths of the fabric strips vary. It gives a lot more interest to it rather than having the same width all along. Plus, depending on the size of your foundation, you may only get 2 or 3 or 4, maybe at the most, pieces of fabric across if they're quite wide, which again doesn't make for a very effective strip piece block. But if you have leftover jelly roll strips, they can work really well in a strip piece block, but they tend to be pretty wide and take up most of the block foundation, again, if you're working with smaller squares. So what can you do? Well, you can still use your jelly roll strip, absolutely, but you want to cut it down so it's a little narrower. And depending on how you cut it, you may even get 2 pieces that you can use in either this or a separate block. So there's 2 pieces there, and I could use those in 2 different blocks. So you definitely can use your jelly roll strips, just cut them a little thinner and they're more effective in your strip piece block. Tip number 5 has to deal with the corner on the foundation. Specifically in the case where you are so close to the edge of the foundation that when you add that final piece of fabric on, only a little tiny bit of it will show once that strip piece block, I should say, is stitched into your project. And that's because you'll have the 1/4-inch seam going one way and a 1/4 another way, and you may end up with just a little tiny itsy bitsy piece of fabric there, and that's definitely not what you want. So how can you fix this? Well, there's a couple different ways to do that. depending on how much fabric, or how much foundation I should say, is showing at the end, when you add that last piece of fabric on, you could add it on with a wider seam allowance. So instead of doing your 1/4 inch seam allowance, do a 1/2 inch, for example, and then that will take up more of the previous piece and it'll allow more of that final piece to show. Another thing you can do, depending on the width of the strip just before the final one you'll be putting on, if it's wide enough, you could actually fold back your foundation and cut it down a bit. And by doing that, when you go to add this final piece, you'll be seeing more of it, a little bit less of this strip, but that's okay, and more of that. In any case, you want to make sure that you don't have a tiny, tiny piece of fabric in that corner on your foundation. And here's a bonus tip. What if your 1/4 inch seam isn't perfect? Well, this type of block is very forgiving. It's a great opportunity to practice your perfect 1/4 inch seam, but if your 1/4 inch seam isn't perfect, no worries, it doesn't affect the look of the final block. I hope you found these tips helpful, and I hope you will try some strip piece blocks. Remember to look in the description below for different videos on strip piece blocks. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your quilting friends. And remember to subscribe and hit the bell so you'll be notified the next time I release a new video. And before you go, check out these videos I've included for you on strip piece blocks. There. Oh my God. That was a lot to go through and a lot to remember. Okay.